So I just want to start by welcoming everyone to the final event for this year's Sociology Colloquium series. And this is sponsored by the Social Science Student Donation Fund. So again, for those people who don't know me yet, my name is Katie Mendez, and I'm going to be opening the event today. And I want to start by welcoming everyone to Western University and acknowledge that it's located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Unapuak, and Chinatong nations. So with that, I'm going to pass you off to Andrea Wilson, who will formally welcome our speakers today.
My challenge in introducing these two today is to not take up all of our allotted time telling you about their accomplishments. Both have had entire ceremonies devoted to that, so I'm going to try to hit the highlights today. Rick Settersten is a University Distinguished Professor of Human Development and is now also serving as Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs at Oregon State University. And Rick's work has been prominent in the development of life course studies, both theoretically and empirically, and it really cuts across multiple disciplines. His work has been recognized with a Distinguished Lifetime Career Award of the Society for the Study of Human Development and many other outstanding scholarship awards. And he was a key member of the MacArthur Research Network for many years that focused on transitions to adulthood and public policy. And much of his work has focused on the health and well-being of marginalized young adults, as well as on precarity and aging. And then Glen is the Odum Distinguished Research Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And as many of you know, Glen was instrumental in the development of life course theory and research. Glen has over 87,000 citations, which demonstrates just how incredibly influential he's been, not only in life course research and sociology, but across multiple disciplines and topics. And in 2016, he received the American Sociological Association's highest recognitions, W.E.B. Du Bois Career of Distinguished Scholarship Award. And he's received distinguished career awards from the sections of the American Sociological Association, Society for Research and Child Development, and several others. He was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has more publications in top journals than one can count. What I think, though, those who know Glen would emphasize is his incredible generosity. He's formally mentored over 65 PhD students and postdocs and informally guided and influenced countless others. So he's really touched the lives and careers of so many of us over the years. So we're so excited to have the opportunity to hear about the book that Glen, Rick, and their co-author, Lisa Pierce, recently published, Living on the Edge. And I'm going to turn it over to Glen and Rick.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Glen, did you want to say something?
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back here. I visited probably in the early century, I think, when Kim and Andrea were already at the university. And so it's nice to come back and to bring a book, talk about a book that has almost been that long in its birth process. It's taken a long time to put together, and I'm going to tell the story of how this all happened, because when I finished Children of the Great Depression, that was kind of the beginning of this, and I will indicate how I got together with Rick and Lisa, and how this all made possible the book we have to talk about today. So our story then began in 1972-73 as I completed Children of the Great Depression at the Berkeley Institute of Human Development. This project followed a birth cohort of 1920-21 in Oakland, California, through the Great Depression up to middle age. The study left me and others wondering about the Depression's effect on younger children. With this in mind, I turned to the Berkeley cohort, born in 1928-29, to find out. And it provided compelling evidence of a differential effect by cohort and gender. Namely, the younger Berkeley boys were more impaired than the Oakland boys by family hardship. No such effect was observed among the girls, owing in large measure to the protection their mothers provided. Children of the Great Depression also made clear the analytic benefit of a long-term study of social change and its effects. The Oakland study revealed a positive impact of growing up in hardship for boys, but it neglected their exposure to World War II, which seems almost impossible given how large it was and everything, but they basically paid no attention to it at the Institute. We later discovered that most of the Oakland boys, 91%, had served in World War II and benefited from the GI Bill. Fortunately, data were also collected on the lives of the Berkeley parents, the mothers and the fathers, as well as the study child. This enabled us to address the lifelong impact of a changing society on the 1900 generation. During 1972-73, my sabbatical year at Berkeley, I focused on the Berkeley generation of 1900, since I saw real good possibilities for a major book on their lives. And I began developing an outline and drafts of chapters year by year into the next century. By 2010, I realized I really needed assistance and turned to Rick Settersten and Lisa Pierce in my own department for help in turning the drafts into chapters of a book. I wanted to ensure that this labor of love over the years made it across the finish line. After nearly 50 years on this project, I still wonder how I could have taken it on at the time. And my answer now is that it represented something like a mountain I had to climb, a challenge I had to take. And my confidence in doing so came from working on children of the Great Depression. This decade-long project told me how to work with archival data. Old data must be reworked in a recoding process, a story we told in working with archival data in 1993. Now I'm going to turn to some observations on the study itself. This project was launched in the 20s, an era marked by an emerging scientific study of children and their development in the United States. This line of study called for observations of children over time, in contrast to the popularity of cross-sectional surveys and recollections of the past, which told us nothing about change in people's lives. As such, it was clearly a pioneer in the study of lives decades before the launching of major longitudinal studies in the United States and Europe during the 40s and the 50s. In the mid-20s, Jean McFarland became director with a PhD in clinical studies at Berkeley. Her sample was uniquely designed as both intergenerational and longitudinal, with mother, father, and study child born in 1928-29. All three members of each family were to be followed across time. And the big idea behind this was the notion that Jean had of studying relationships, family relationships, intergenerational relationships, as well as relationships, intra-family. The parents were born from 1885 to 1908 and were divided into the 19th and 20th century cohorts to capture these markedly different historical times. Berkeley, with its University of California, had great appeal as an educational center, and 60% of the men and women in our sample were in the middle class. By contrast, the adjacent business community of Oakland, in children of the Great Depression, was evenly divided on social class. It was a very different economic world, Oakland was. Data collected for the Berkeley study began with a family origin interview of parents by G. McFarland in 1930. That was followed by annual data collections from 1929 to 1947. Interviews were central in these follow-ups, by the way. A major follow-up was carried out in late life in 1969-70. That really is the big follow-up in the later years. And interviews were wrapped up the data collection in the 1980s. What is the most important feature of this book? We felt it tells the story of how American lives were shaped across the 20th century, a time of truly revolutionary change in our way of life. The initial reviewers of our book manuscript, described it as a one-of-a-kind study. And by that, they meant there is no other comparable data archive for a prospective study of lives across these years in America. And I'll wrap my contribution up by focusing on essential theme of the study, pathways and emotional health. We followed the 19...
Actually, Glenn, if you wouldn't mind, let's pause there and let's bring that up to that theme up toward the end.
Oh, okay, fine.
Is that okay?
That's fine.
Perfect. So anything else you wanted to add about setting the stage for the project?
No.
Okay.
That can go anywhere. So.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much. I hope that helped provide some context for just the long haul of the project and of our collaboration over the last decade. I'll go back to this this photo, Glenn, which I only had on the screen for a second, but this is one of those key moments in the life of a project. It's from the ASA meetings in 2012 in Denver, and we rented a working room in the hotel and shacked up there for a couple of days, really laying out the broad brushstrokes of the book and the big narratives of the book. You can see the frantic writing on the whiteboard in the background. But I think and I think we've all aged a little since then. But you know, we all regard this as really one of the most precious professional experiences of our lives, and what a joy it was for us to work on this for a decade. And some things just take that long. Anyway. And before I forget, let me thank Andrea and Caitlin and Howard and Amy and everybody on the Western team for hosting us today. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of key themes. So Glenn, you'll come in here at the end on how the past matters for understanding health and well-being in the later years. And I'll take up just very briefly a couple of the first three themes, which focus on how this generation becomes how they become pioneers in navigating work and family life, how they set the stage, surprisingly, for the intensive parenting that we know today, and how their lives, especially in that relentless decade of the Great Depression, really provide such an intimate and, in a way, grueling portrait of how hard it is to make ends meet, and how challenging it is, and how important, and yet how important and critical it is to rely on family for support during hard times. So we'll just very briefly talk about these. We'll work toward a close then, and actually the thing we're most looking forward to is the discussion. So there's only so much we can say in a session like this, but that should give us plenty to talk about, plus lots of other things that you'll have on your minds. So let me say a few things about the gendered navigation of work and family. So in the post-World War II era, education is sharply increasing. 19% of the women in our sample graduated from college, and 33% of the men did. Opportunities for paid work and for career development in the San Francisco Bay Area were abundant. They were abundant for men, and they were abundant for unmarried women. So employment is going to vary by education, by social class and gender. But it's important to keep in mind that at this time, the median age of marriage is actually in the mid-20s. We have somehow this misunderstanding of the past that the age of marriage in this early part of the last century was very young. It's in the mid-20s. And so it's the norm, much like today, for unmarried adults to work. And members of this study really reflect fondly on their times and on these times in their interviews. They like their independence, they like their earnings, they like their social lives. So when women married and had children, women almost universally quit working. And some interpret this as a kind of choice to return to women's traditional roles, but that's overly simplistic. There's not much choice in it. Women were socialized toward female occupations for that time before marriage, and then for homemaking after marriage. And on the heels of the right to vote, on just securing the right to vote, these women actually saw their potential for progress as being not outside of the domestic sphere, but inside. They are going to express agency by redefining marriage as more companionate, and by redefining parenthood as being more science-driven. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Men, on the other hand, worked very long hours, many in factories and firms, and as one of the men in the study noted, so in the words of one of the men in the study, when a husband and wife are separated a lot, like happens nowadays because of the nature of the husband's work, they tend to grow apart. During my childhood, men mostly worked on their own small farms and shops, and husbands and wives were always in each other's company. So part of what's going to be happening in our story as their lives unfold is this increased spatial separation of work and family life. We can come back to that later. By the Great Depression, of course, many men had lost their jobs or had their salaries cut, and the loss of pay was really hard on men, in part because of the mandate that they be breadwinners. And Glen is going to talk a little bit about that as he talks about the legacy of that for the later years. Women's work, on the other hand, in the Great Depression era, was interpreted as being done for the welfare of the family. And many of the 1900 generation, as I noted before, had worked in jobs prior to marriage. And so they seamlessly moved back into them. They were teachers and nurses and bookkeepers and telephone operators, things like that. So when men could be really pragmatic and appreciate their wives' work, marriages also seemed strengthened. By World War II, scholars often focus on, of course, the move of women into manual labor in wartime industries. And as we've noted the whole Bay Area is a key site of mobilization, wartime mobilization in the United States. So it leaves such a mark on life in this era and in that place. Of course, women's entry into these manual jobs, well, that was epitomized by images of Rosie the Riveter. But the Rosies were actually younger and unmarried. So they were unlike the women of the 1900 generation who were married and in their 30s and 40s during the war years. So they in some ways picked up the work that was left behind by the younger women. But the women reflect back quite nostalgically on their wartime work experience, whereas men, again, as was true in the Depression, they benefited from the resurgence of opportunity and available jobs in World War II, but the demands on their time and their energy are going to be intense. And so they, in contrast to the women, look back on those war years as extraordinarily frenzied and stressful. I just want to show you this because it is surprising just how much how much women worked for being, quote, traditional women. In this figure, you'll see women's pathways through work during 3 distinct eras, before family formation, during the Great Depression, and during World War II. And so if you look at that first row especially, 30% of these women were in the labor force at some point during all 3 eras. 30% only worked prior to marriage, and these women were mainly in middle-class families that had very little deprivation. And only 7% did not work in any of the 3 eras. So, you know, again, these data allow us to see something that's not currently in the historical record. Let me turn to this topic of how they set the stage for the intensive parenting that we know today. Again, these precious archives allow us to discover that the seeds of today's child-focused parenting can be found in the markedly different strategies of parents a century ago. These parents from this 1900 generation, especially those who were in the middle class, are going to be at the forefront of a deep cultural shift in parenting. So they're going to be the first generation of parents to see really revolutionary advances in the amount and quality of childcare information, as I noted there on the slide. The science related to child development emerges in the 1920s, along with a new commitment to conducting research that's intentionally aimed at fostering the development of children and fostering the well-being of families. So they're going to be swept up in that current. They come to learn that parenting is a skill that has to be learned and mastered. They provide opportunities for their kids that they themselves did not have. They talk about wanting to provide their children experiences in music and art and dancing. They talk about the need for better clothes and toys, better nutrition, better health care, better education. They talk about the need for more involved parents and less troubled family relationships, and the need for greater economic security in raising children. Several of the parents actually say that they intentionally decided to have fewer children in order to provide more for them. As a middle-class father noted here, parents used to have an easier time raising children because they didn't pay so much attention to them. They didn't give them all kinds of special lessons and worry over their adjustments. Our children have been tied up in one thing or another ever since they were born. Any number of the parents in this room might have uttered the same words, right? Also, one downside to being better schooled in parenting was that they were a lot more worried about their children's outcomes and about their own incompetence as parents. As one middle-class mother observed here, there's been so much propaganda on parents to point out our psychological responsibilities that we are always over anxious. Previously, parents just let their children grow up and hope they would turn out for the best. If they didn't, that was due to the child. Whereas parents of our generation worry about what we have done wrong. Again, a very contemporary sounding quote. And because knowledge of child development was growing, couples were also a lot more conscious of the role of fathers in the development of children. And many of these men wanted to become better husbands and fathers, and many of these women are actively coaching them in that direction. They're really struggling with how to raise kids in a new world. And this is again going to be especially accentuated by the context of the Bay Area and by that wartime period, especially as the children are preteens and teens. Kids have greater mobility. There are plentiful temptations in the area. Parents feel a compromised ability to exert their influence. And in that Bay Area, again, there's a kind of supercharged nature of life, and it left parents worried about youth delinquency and sexual promiscuity, especially with so many troops coming in and out of the Bay Area and through train stations and the port. They also speak about the moral threat of the movies and of the radio. And here too, you could easily switch the movies or the radio for the internet or the digital world, and you would find the quotes equally compelling. So parents' knowledge is going to leave them more aware of the inherently ambiguous role and the uncertain nature of their role as parents. And they also talk about how intentionally they're working to shrink the generation gap. And they talk about wanting to foster greater equality in the parent-child relationship, recognizing that it brings some new benefits, but also brings some new threats. Okay, let me just say a couple things about the family support theme, and then Glenn, you can move into that final theme for us on health and well-being in the later years. So again, that relentless depression of the decade is such a great window into the challenges of family relations and family support. One thing that's important to keep in mind here is that members of this generation are forming their families and raising kids before any of the government programs that we know today were even in place, right? And at a time when the receipt of public aid was deeply stigmatizing. So facing hard times really meant relying on family members for support, finding it wherever you could. And across that decade, 4 out of 5 families are pretty deeply involved in exchanges with family, either in providing support to them or needing to ask for it from relatives. So those who needed help often talk about the shame and embarrassment they feel in needing to ask for it. And those who give help often talk about their reservations about doing so, and even resentment and hostility in having to provide it. These kinds of tensions are going to be especially strong among middle-class families. And part of that is because more of them were spared unemployment and major income loss. So the burden of giving help is partly carried a little more by them. But working class families, it turns out, even though they may have fewer resources to give of those things more freely. They are much more responsive to relatives in need, and they accept burdens, often even in the most trying of circumstances, and to a wider network of family members than middle-class families. Sharing housing becomes the least preferred method of helping others. Many had no choice. Over half of the families in our sample hosted relatives at some point in the 1930s, most of those stays being more than 3 years. So again, you get a sense of the depth and the duration of that kind of help. Doubling up means often bringing parents into your household, not having young adults come back or stay longer, which is more the discussion today, right? And doubling up is going to make for crowded households, and it's often grandmothers who are in the house also helping with the raising of children. And it's here that we especially see a kind of clash between the old world and the new world when it comes to ideas about how it is and how it is you should raise children and what it is you should be doing in the family realm. So lots of tensions there. I guess what I would want to end with here is just to say, what we're most struck by, I think, in that decade is just how profoundly that decade leaves an imprint on them. You hear their lives aching of really difficult choices. Not having additional children because of the economic hardship, having to let go of those hopes, having to give up their homes, having to leave behind their possessions, having to make extraordinary reductions in their household consumption, losing their social status and having to save face interpersonally and socially. I think these are all things that just really emerge in that Depression decade in particular. Glenn, I'll turn it over to you now to say a little something about the past and late life.
Before I get into that, I just wanted to say something about data measurement, because this chapter we were able to do on kinship, living in the midst of kin. This is a topic that G. McFarland paid no attention to, collected no instruments based on or focused on that issue. But because she did intensive, very inclusive interviews, we could go through the interviews and develop a coding scheme and pick up contacts with kin and the kind of interactions they had. And so all this entire chapter and some of the others drew upon our ability to do that. The wealth of an archive with many waves of interviews is just priceless, really. It gives you all kinds of degrees of freedom. And it's the heart of going back to an old archive and recoding it. The more interviews you have there, the more you can do with it. And if everything is structured in the instrument, that really limits what you can do. I've tried to work with both types, and so just wanted to mention that because it gives you a little more appreciation for the nature of doing the chapters we've done. And this is one that really required intensive interviewing and then or reviewing of everything and then developing a coding scheme. To turn to pathways and emotional health, we followed the 1900 generation from the prosperous 20s into the economic collapse of the 30s, followed by then a boom, an economic boom. So you had very prosperous 20s, the bottom falling out, and then the war years bringing unknown prosperity to many of the families. They had to work very hard during this period, and that is one of the strains that the men especially had to deal with, and the women too, because many of them were in the workforce. At all points across these momentous years of the 20th century, the the Berkeley men turned out to be less healthy emotionally than the women. Men lost and women gained emotional health during these years. A major reason, we think, the role options for husbands lock them in to what we call a breadwinner mandate, with expectations that they would and must support their family. They were caught in a no-win situation. There was no argument that would give them some understanding in this predicament. And so this inability to support their family led a good many to despair and to intense feelings of shame, to scenes like a husband, for example, described by a visiting observer, staff observer. Husband with head in his hands, grieving at the kitchen table, and his wife standing beside him, crying, hysterical, because she was told he was going to take his life. Married women were homemakers in the culture, not paid employees, though some Berkeley wives held half-time jobs across the years while their children were in school during the war years. And then, of course, afterward, both roles then became a source of great self-confidence and resilience in their lives. And we could see it all the way into old age. There were women who were still working in their 70s, and they were saying they were determined to stand on their own after going through the Depression crisis, where they couldn't find support for their family and all the suffering that had to go on as a result. So some 30 years after hardship, among 40 surviving couples, wives emerged as more agentic and resilient than their husbands. Now, I'm going to turn to a very interesting theme, and that is dualities in life. This is kind of my wrap up of some of the issues of hardship and good times and bad times and all of that. If you follow the Berkeley generation across time through these good times, bad times, and so on, you discover that there's not just one view or one experience in a time, either a bad time or a good time. There's a mix. And Charles Dickens, I think, referred to the good times. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. This is what we see in the Great Depression. It's what we see in the 40s and other decades. For example, looking back across their life, in the 20s, there was the challenge to become self-supporting, becoming self-supporting, and then there were the joys of marriage. They were getting married in this period. They were having children in this period, beginning to. In the Great Depression, this was the worst of times, clearly, but this was really the period when most of the children came along, and they were bringing up these children. So it was a very special time, and yet it was such an emotionally straining time for the family too. And then you have the war years. Prosperity comes around again, but husbands and wives are working very long hours, and they talk about, we lived through this decade of no work, and then we have too much work and long hours across the week, every day. Many of them were working very long hours. As one husband said to his wife, did the sun shine today? Because he went to work before the sun up, and he came back after the sun was down. And that was kind of the way it was for an awful lot of families. So I think it's useful to think in terms of the dualities that exist, because in many ways people were thinking, historians have thought about these periods in terms of their dualities. I think Sorokin was one of them, and they were certainly present. And you can see, in a sense, the dualities enabled people to survive in a challenging time. It wasn't all bad, it was all good, but it was a mix of both. So I will close with that and open it up, I guess, for.
Excellent. Glenn, why don't I just make a couple of other quick remarks to close us out then. One of the things I love about what Glenn was just talking about is something that that we were so aware of in being able and so privileged to be able to track a group of people over such a long period of time, is that rather than understanding an event in isolation, just the Depression or just the war, what we're struck by is how crucial it is to understand the ways in which those things interrelate, how they zigzag across the century, and the kinds of things that they encounter, and maybe we can take that up as part of our discussion as well, what that might mean for more recent generations and the multiple events that have marked their lives, and how and those swings of hardship and recovery and affluence, but other things as well. We think about this group then as we call them a hinge generation. This is Leonard Kane's phrase from a 1967 article in the Gerontologist, I think. But we like this phrase because we think it just so nicely captures this group that straddled those two centuries. They're hinged between the past and the present, and their lives are going to be, as we described, dramatically different than the generations before them. But what's going to be important is that they're going to instigate a set of changes and navigate a set of changes that will continue to echo for subsequent generations across the century. And I think at the end of the project, we're left with a reinforced sense of this reality that many of the things that we assume are unique to our own times are actually shared with and built upon the ideas and the actions of people long before us. And that many of the things we take to be modern challenges are not at all modern in many ways. The forms may be modern, but some of the challenges are quite timeless. And I'll stop there. Thank you for your presence with us today, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Glenn and Rick. That was really fascinating, and I love the points you were making at the end. Both of you, I think they're great jumping off points for discussion. I'll open it up for questions. Katie, you have your hand up. So.
Yeah, just first, thank you both so much. I just really, really enjoyed that presentation. And I do feel in a way that maybe my mind has been blown, or there's some stereotypes or ideas that I think are being challenged. And the one that really interests me is about the women in the workforce, that 30% of women who stayed in the workforce during those periods. And I was wondering if you can say something a bit more about maybe their class or what kind of jobs. So were these working class women? Were these mostly middle class women? Were they college educated? I'm just really curious to find out more about that cohort.
Well, I would just simply say the 20s really opened up the working with the white collar dimension. And that's what you really see all the way through into the war years. Women going in and filling many jobs, white collar jobs in teaching, and you can just enumerate the opportunities, and they were open for women. And so that's what we see in the Depression years, with women being able to go into the workforce and get jobs, despite the criticism of neighbors that they're taking jobs away from men. They were not taking jobs away from men, because these were jobs that men did not occupy. And so these jobs were opening up, increasing over this period of time. We had department stores. We had all of these innovations of the 20s and so on taking place. And women played a big role in these areas, I think. And my mother, for example, and father are members of this 1900 generation, and both taught school. And my mother taught English, and she was teaching right straight through this period. And my father moved into medicine at a certain point. But I think the issue is really how women's lives changed as a function of the economy changing, basically, and opening up opportunities that were really quite good for them and for the country. Yeah.
And can I just ask a quick follow-up? Sorry, did you, in the interviews, I mean, did you get any sense of tension? So those kind of women who stayed in the workforce, did they speak about, did their husbands, were they encouraging? Were they, what was that like?
Yes, they would talk about it. And yes, wives, well, I think both of us have read interviews where they talk about, my husband doesn't approve, but I want to work and he lets me do that, and so on. So there was kind of a give and take there in that regard. Sometimes during the war, their husband was overseas. She went back to teaching and full-time teaching and so on. So there were a lot of changes that opened up opportunities for women, but there was a lot of discussion, and it was kind of an unwritten thing that he doesn't like it, but I'm doing it anyway, And
yeah, and as I said before, Caitlin, in marriages where husbands, especially where there's economic need, and husbands can kind of acknowledge the wife's role in helping the family, it's hard on his sense of self, as Glenn was talking about earlier, and what's expected of him socially, and yet it does help them meet crucial needs during those pivotal times. And we should probably move on, but let me also say that for working class women, however, I mean, the rates of participation have always been higher, and their hours, their record of work is more continuous. The hours are longer, and we see that in our data too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll move to Joseph.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Glenn. Glenn, I interviewed with you for grad school back in the late 1980s, but I didn't go to UNC. I went to UVA. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you did. And we're playing you.
Remember me? Anyway,
yes,
no.
That's right.
But let me preface my question with a couple of data points that confirm what you folks have been presenting, and then challenge you in some respects as well.
Yeah, good.
So a couple of data points. So my father and both sides of my parents sort of fit many of your criteria. They fit within the generation. I'm actually much older than I look. But my father benefited. He was lost during the Depression. He was in his 20s, and World War II really saved him. Right. So he fits that theme perfectly. Yes. My grandmother, who wasn't actually much older on my mother's side, not much older than my dad, was a real Rosie the Riveter. Yeah. She stayed until the end of the war. One of only 2 women, by the way, in her area that actually stayed. And so that saved her because she was a divorced mom at that time.
Yeah.
And finally, on a sad note, my father's father committed suicide in the 30s, precisely as you described, in terms of the depression, his own feelings of failure, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that all set the stage for my own family's trajectory. So in many ways, I identified tremendously with with your work and so forth. Here's my question, though. We're really only describing, though, not just a certain cohort, but even a certain class. And if you will, if you think about the geographic and ethnic diversity in the United States. So to what extent then do you address, or are you able to address that kind of diversity, as opposed to people like myself and my family who fit that theme? Really, we're the Polish peasant, if you go back to
that's right. Yeah.
How do you address that and reconcile that kind of diversity with the stories with the narratives that you're sharing, which are so important?
Yeah. Well, we get this question frequently because we need to understand why the composition of this sample is what it is. And we all start with a sample drawn in history some way. This is a sample that represents Berkeley in the 20s. And Berkeley in the 20s was not a brown or black, didn't have that segment of the sample at all, but in the war years, it did. And the people from the South and from the southern part, from Mexico and from the south of the country, came in large numbers to work in the shipyards and so on. So Berkeley changed dramatically in composition, and there's nothing we can do to change what we had to begin with. And we simply have to say it's a slice of America at that time. This is their story. It's not America's story necessarily, because it's only part of that story. And that's something I think we should have laid out in much more vivid ways, because I think that it comes up frequently. People feeling that, well, this really doesn't talk about the minorities, the diversity of the country. And that's true. I mean, at the very same time, we could sample the New England colonies and come up with very different composition too. And
it's a slice of American life, though, that as Glenn said, in a time and in a place. But because there are these restrictions in the way the sample begins, and part of the beauty that we're able to capitalize on is that it starts as a place-based sample, right? So so all those early years, much of their lives, they're found in a place that we can. So much of what we were doing in the course of writing the book is bringing in that context, showing how people are interacting in a social world that's changing, and that's the important point there, Joseph, that it's changing. So in the interviews, we hear these families wrestling with the fact that there's suddenly in wartime, as Glen said, a massive influx of poor whites from the South.
Yeah, poor whites.
And of poor blacks from the South. Suddenly, so it becomes this amazing laboratory in a way to kind of hear what they're saying about how the worlds they're now confronting are different from the worlds they knew. And so also in wartime, of course, the ways in which the presence of Japanese in the Bay Area presented a threat to life. And these families are wrestling with the fact that the friends of the Japanese friends of their children suddenly disappear because they're yanked out and sent to the internment camps, right? So you're through these families, we're seeing how American life is changing and how the composition of changing. But as Glen said, we're also kind of stuck with the sample. I think so many of the themes that we illuminate in the book would have applied to other groups, but probably have been heightened in the intensity of the struggle as they confront these different periods. And the other thing is that, of course, there's some selectivity around California and the Bay Area. I mean, in terms of, again, of America's story and about who comes.
Yeah.
And about the families that make their way across our nation or come from other parts of the world in exactly this moment and settle there. And so it's also a story of settlement and about migration patterns and about the selectivity and the kinds of people who are drawn to a new world. And the kinds of things that Berkeley has to offer, in particular with the university there, with a great healthcare system. You know, but I think those are all things we do wrestle with a lot in the second chapter, is to sort of trying to help tell that story about who these families are and where they came from, and how the legacy of their own past and their journey to California also helps set the stage for the way their lives unfold after that.
Yeah, a third of the families came from overseas, and so it really has. Migration from Europe is a significant part of the story, but it really is a laboratory of population history. And you need population history to understand how we end up as we follow these people into old age. Berkeley is a different place because of the newcomers and all of the changes taking place in the country, you know.
So it's 1 o'clock now, and we are going to stay on for further discussion. Anyone who would like to stick around, especially graduate students, we really want to preserve some of this time for the grad students to be able to talk to Rick. But Sean, do you want to ask your question, or do you want to? And then anyone who needs to go, we appreciate you coming, and everyone who can stay, please do. Okay.